No. Yes. Well, welcome to St. Peter's for this meeting of the Canterbury Contemporary Theology Group. It's a great pleasure to welcome Richard Norman, who quite a lot of us know as Rick, an emeritus professor from the University of Kent. Richard is well known in Canterbury for his involvement in local community issues and is an emeritus professor of moral philosophy from the University of Kent. Richard's work has been mainly in the areas of ethics and political philosophy. His book, The Moral Philosophers, has been widely used in courses on moral philosophy. Among his publications, Ethics, Killing and War is particularly relevant to tonight's subject. Richard is a humanist and a patron of Humanist UK, currently active on the coordinating committee of Humanist Climate Action, and he's an active member of CANDIFA, Canterbury and District Interfaith Action. So it's a great pleasure and a privilege, Richard, to have you address us on the knotty question of pacifism.
And it's an honour to be invited here. It's not the first time that I've talked to this group, and whenever I do so, I have to say I always feel a fraud. I mean, my full title this evening is "Should All Christians Be Pacifists?" Well, I have to say it's not for me to say, as a humanist, which is why I added that subclause. And what about humanists? So I feel a fraud, but nevertheless, I will do my best. And thanks very much also for asking me to talk on this topic, because it's one of the many subjects about which, as I grow older, I increasingly become uncertain what it is that I really think. But what I'm going to do is to look at the issue of peace and war and pacifism from both Christian and humanist perspectives. Initially, to think a bit about whether there are significant differences in approach, but for the most part, I want to explore what I hope may be common ground between Christian and humanist perspectives. But to start with a likely point of difference, where is the clicker, by the way? To start with a likely point of difference, I think that Christians, unlike humanists, are very likely to look to biblical texts for guidance. And this is where it should be my first slide. Okay, shall I just call out to you when I want you? So, an obvious text that Christians are likely to appeal to in this context is the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but Jesus says, I say unto you, do not resist the evildoer. Right? Let's see how that works. Whoever strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other to him as well. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, and so on. That may look like an unequivocal basis for Christian pacifism, but I think I'm right in saying most Christians haven't drawn that conclusion historically. Why not? Well, I think at least some, probably many, would say, well, it's intended, what Jesus says there is intended to apply to how we live in our personal life, but not to the public sphere. That's different. The question of relations between states is not the same as the relation between individuals. And along those lines, click, the technology. Has it gone off completely? All right. I've skipped one now. Right? Okay, that's in suggesting that there's a difference between the ethics of personal life and the ethics of relations between states. I think a classic text Christians might appeal to is Paul's letter to the Romans, where Paul says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. There's no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God." Skip a bit there, and Paul goes on to say that those in authority are God's servant for your good. The sovereign does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. And that could be quite plausibly taken to imply, if your ruler goes to war to execute justice, then it's your duty to obey because your ruler is divinely appointed. What that seems to me to illustrate is that, as is typically the case, I think, invoking texts can't settle the moral question, because texts are always open to differing interpretations. And what I'd also suggest is that how people interpret the texts will be largely dependent on their prior moral and ethical convictions rather than the other way around. It's because people are or are not pacifists that they will interpret those texts in different ways rather than taking their pacifist or non-pacifist conclusions from the texts. The same goes, I think, for what might seem to be an even more unequivocal basis for pacifism, the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." Again, that looks pretty straightforward. It's a statement of the value of life as a fundamental value, and a fundamental shared value, of course, between Christians and humanists and across all religion and belief perspectives. But I think it's important to look more closely at what is meant by it. A phrase that's often used in ethical texts is the phrase, "the sanctity of life." But I think there's a problem with that way of putting it. The problem with the phrase, "the sanctity of life," suggests that what's valued is life in the abstract, the mere existence of biological life, of being alive. I want to suggest, and I hope again that this is shared common ground, that we should think of the value of life not in terms of an abstract concept of life, but of lives in the plural, individual lives of individual people. That's what's of value. To recognize the value of life, therefore, to recognize the wrongness of taking life, is to recognize that each individual human life is unique and irreplaceable, and that's why the value of lives is so fundamental a value. There are many wrongs of many kinds that we can do to one another as human beings, some of them terrible wrongs. We can injure or maim one another, enslave or coerce or humiliate one another. But to take a person's life from them, to end their life against their will, is the most fundamental wrong, because it's the one that's most fundamentally irreplaceable, irreversible. Nothing can compensate for the loss of life for the person whose life it is. That recognition of the irreplaceable value of each human life is, I think, the most persuasive starting point for a commitment to pacifism. It was the starting point for Dick Sheppard, who in the 1930s founded the Peace Pledge Union and was also, of course, the Dean of Canterbury Cathedral. And in a sermon that he gave in 1937, Dick Sheppard said, "The art of killing is the essence of war, and no Christian can uphold war unless he is prepared to kill his brother." As he goes on to say, the core of Christian pacifism is the belief that it is never right to take human life. So that's a pretty clear attempt to base Christian pacifism on the injunction, "Thou shalt not kill," the value of each individual human life. And that looks like a pretty clear, firm moral stance. Killing is the essence of war, a simple truth that it's vital to recognize, I think. It's essential not to compartmentalize war, to put it in a separate moral category and think that the ethics of war is something different from the ethics of the rest of life. War a fundamental starting point for all thinking about this subject. War is the killing of our fellow human beings. The recognition of that is a regular theme in the literature of war. Typically, there's the moment of recognition in so much of fiction and poetry about war, the moment of recognition by a soldier that the enemy is a human being like yourself. A famous example is Wilfred Owen's poem, Strange Meeting, where he, in a dream, has a vision of someone who addresses him and says, "I am the enemy you killed, my friend." Another classic example is a passage from the famous novel of the First World War by Erich Remarque, All Quiet on the Western Front. I think there's a new film being made about it, which I haven't seen, but that's a still from an old film. A key moment in the novel, which is illustrated by that clip from the old film, Paul, the narrator, finds himself in a shell hole with, Paul is a German soldier, finds himself in a shell hole with a French soldier that he's killed. And when the French soldier has died, he looks through his papers, sees pictures of his wife and child and the work that he did, and he addresses the dead French soldier, "Comrade, I did not want to kill you, but you were only an idea to me before, an abstraction that lived in my mind and called forth its appropriate response. It was that abstraction I stabbed, but now for the first time I see you are a man like me. I thought of your hand grenades, your bayonet, your rifle. Now I see your wife, and your face, and our fellowship. Forgive me, comrade, how could you be my enemy?" And it's that recognition of the humanity of the enemy as a fellow human being that's, I think, the moral impulse at the heart of pacifism, and I would want to suggest it should be at the heart of all our thinking about war. But then it's not necessarily that's not the end of the matter, not the end of the argument. Because what we have to consider then is what philosophers sometimes refer to as the problem of acts and omissions. The fact that we're morally responsible, not just for what we do, we're also morally responsible for what we fail to do, what we left undone, the evils, the harms that we've failed to prevent. The wording of the General Confession. Do people still say the General Confession? We have to confess not only that we've done those things which we ought not to have done, but also we've left undone those things which we ought to have done. So if the value of each human life is a fundamental value, then that would imply then that not only that it's wrong to kill and that we have a moral responsibility not to kill, but also we may be acting morally if we fail to save lives, if we fail to prevent people being killed. And then the moral crunch comes, of course, because maybe sometimes the only way to prevent more people being killed is to kill the killer. Think of a recent school shooting in Nashville. I was going to refer to it as the recent shooting in the United States. The trouble is, tragically, there are so many that it's not the most recent one. But in that particular case, someone broke into a school, started shooting people, killed 6 people, I think, and the police shot him dead. Now, of course, all those cases are controversial, but you can see why they had to shoot the killer to prevent many, many more people being killed. And so that's the problem for pacifism, obviously, the fundamental problem, that may it not sometimes be morally necessary to kill another human being to prevent them from killing others, and if so, if that is the case, then we at least have to raise the question whether it might sometimes be right to kill to protect other values. For example, the shared life that we've made for ourselves, the life of a community, the right to live free from oppression. Is war sometimes the only way to prevent a greater evil? So, if the wrongness of killing is the value that is at the heart of the case for pacifism, and I'm suggesting the problem of acts and omissions is at the heart of the challenge for pacifism. So, how might a pacifist, Christian or non-Christian, respond to that challenge? I'll come back later to what might be said at an individual level about killing one person to save other lives. But at the level of large-scale social and political rights and wrongs, what might be said in answer to the question, don't we have to sometimes kill to prevent a worse evil, is the claim that war is actually never an effective way of preventing evils. War is never an effective way of saving lives or protecting other values. That's the claim that was made by another member of the Peace Pledge Union in another pamphlet that Aldous Huxley wrote at the request of Dick Sheppard. The Case for Constructive Peace was the name of the pamphlet that he wrote for the Peace Pledge Union. And in that he addresses the problem of ends and means, which Huxley sees as fundamental. And what Huxley there claims is basically war is not an effective means of achieving the ends, the morally desirable ends that we want to achieve. This is how he puts it. War, however just it may seem, cannot be waged without the commission of frightful injustices. Those cannot be committed without arousing resentment and hatred of those on whom they're committed. And I won't read the whole quote, but war then necessarily gives rise to hatred on the part of those against whom we fight, and their hatred cannot be satisfied except by revenge. And so in effect what Huxley is saying there is, in a war we're always sowing the seeds of a future war. War will never resolve things. War will never be an effective way of achieving important values, never be an effective way of preventing even worse evils, because it will always itself sow the seed of further evil and further injustice. As Huxley concludes there, the means determine the ends, and the end achieved by war is not peace, but more war. That's the empirical claim that Huxley makes in his secular defense of humanism. We might wonder whether that's too sweeping a claim about the facts, though. I think writing in 1936, Huxley had in mind the situation bequeathed by the First World War, which ended, of course, with the Treaty of Versailles, and a classic example, then, of a war which ended in such a way as to sow the seeds for the next war, and Huxley was aware of that already in 1936. But how far can we generalize from that example? I think it's true to say that in 1945, the Allies had learned the lesson of the mistakes of the Treaty of Versailles. And so the outcome of the Second World War was not an attempt to humiliate Germany, but the deliberate, constructive building up of a new Germany. And there's no doubt that what the Second World War achieved, at least for the time being, was the defeat of Nazism. So does that confirm that sometimes, at least, war can be a means to good ends? It can be effective in making the world a better place. But then if we're looking at that example, then of course we have to also bear in mind the huge price that was paid for those moral successes. Up to 60 million dead, the majority of them civilians. Massive disruption of social and physical infrastructure in all the countries involved in the war, in Europe at least. Cities flattened, cultural heritage destroyed. And when we're thinking about what happened then, that illustrates a further point, I think. Because war always involves a massive, or typically involves a massive disruption of the social order, its outcomes are deeply unpredictable. And that's what throws doubt on the idea that it's an effective way of, an effective means to the ends that we want to achieve. You never know what the outcome of a war is going to be because it is so massively socially destructive. And of course, the world that emerged in 1945, though it perhaps was a better world, was one that no one could have foreseen in 1939. No one predicted that the outcome of the Second World War would be a Europe and a world, a Western world, divided into two power blocks facing one another, armed with nuclear weapons, a world living permanently with the threat of nuclear war. So my point is then that in wars it's always difficult to control the course of events. And that's why there are strict limits to the possibility of resort to war as a means to desirable ends. It's impossible to know whether it will achieve them or not. So I'm going to suggest then that insofar as there's a case for pacifism, that would be the most plausible one, I think. War is, by its very nature, the taking of human lives on a massive scale. That's the starting point. Then, as I've said, we have the problem of acts and omissions. In principle, maybe war could be the price we have to pay to prevent even greater evils. But then in response to that, we have the problem of ends and means. The methods of war are ill-suited to creating good outcomes. War is always hugely destructive, and we can never be confident that the intended outcomes will be realized. So, the pacifist might say then, we cannot control history. All we can do is try to stay faithful to our fundamental values. And the most fundamental of all is the wrongness of killing, the injunction to love your enemy. We can't try to predict what we might be able to bring about, what better social circumstances we might be able to bring about by waging war. All we can do is stick to those fundamental values. And for a Christian, I take it, that would mean staying true to the ideal represented by the historical Jesus. That seems to me to be a plausible case for pacifism, either for Christians or for humanists. It doesn't, I think, show that either Christians or humanists should be pacifists, but it's a possible stance. I think it's a coherent position and one that deserves respect. But a lot depends, I think, on those empirical claims that I was looking about to what extent we can be confident that war may be a way of preventing even greater evils. So suppose, I've said that it's a possible, pacifism is a possible and a coherent position, but supposing we don't accept it, what's the alternative? If we do hold, in line with the issue of acts and omissions, if we do hold that war for all its evils could sometimes be the only way of preventing even greater evils, how do we decide when that is the case? How do we decide that this is a case where we do have to resort to war for the sake of some greater good? In the Christian tradition, the attempt to answer that question is the tradition that's referred to as just war theory. The tradition of thinking about the ethics of war. I think it's generally reckoned that it was Augustine who first tried to formulate such ideas around the year 400. Aquinas was a key figure in developing the ideas further in the 13th century, and pretty much the sort of modern versions of just war theory came to fruition in the 16th century with people like Vittoria. People thinking particularly about the ethics of war with imperialism and colonialism and the intrusion on countries in the New World and how one should treat the indigenous inhabitants. Just war theory, then. That label is sometimes misunderstood, I think. It's not a theory that says war is always just or by its nature just. On the contrary, what just war theory does is to lay down very strict conditions that have to be met if a war is to be just. Standardly, in the tradition, those conditions for a war being a just war are divided into two parts using the Latin phrases jus ad bellum, what makes it right to go to war, and jus in bello, what it's right to do in a war. Those are the standard conditions that emerged in the tradition as the conditions that have to be satisfied for it to be justifiable to go to war in the first place. The war must be fought for a just cause. It must be to combat an injustice. What that means, I'll come back to in a moment. The condition of proportionality, even if war is engaged in as a way of preventing worse or combating worse injustices, it can't be justified if the outcomes are going to be even worse, even more unjust than those that are being addressed. And then there are other less important conditions there. But those are the conditions the tradition says that have to be met for jus ad bellum. And then the second part of the just war theory is standardly referred to as jus in bello, what it is just or unjust to do in a war. Once you've started a war, once you've decided to go to a war, there are still limits on how you may fight in order to fight war justly. And again, the notion of proportionality comes up there. You should not fight in such a way as to create even worse evils than the ones you're trying to prevent. But also, crucially, what's referred to usually as the principle of non-combatant immunity. That whatever it is that you're fighting for, it's only permissible to fight and to harm and, if necessary, to kill enemy combatants. Innocent civilians must not be attacked or killed. That's a very important principle of jus in bello, very frequently, historically, violated. Here in Canterbury, of course, in the Second World War, the deliberate bombing of cities on both sides was a very clear violation of the principle of non-combatant immunity, deliberate attempt to kill civilians. That's happening with the bombing of Canterbury, but of course, it wasn't a one-sided thing. The bombing of Canterbury was a response to, a few days earlier, the bombing by the Allies of the German city of Cologne. So, the conditions then that make it right to war, go to war in the first place, and the conditions of what it's right to do in a war. Now, going back, as I said, going back to the very first of those conditions, the first condition of jus ad bellum, the war, if it's to be morally acceptable at all, must be fought for a just cause. And of course, the crucial question then is, what counts as a just cause? Not just anything. And that the idea is much further refined than it was in Augustine, who in effect said, like Paul's letter to the Romans, well, your ruler is the judge of justice and injustice, and you just have to obey him. Increasingly, just war tradition focused down on much more specific accounts of what could be a just cause in the first place. And modern versions of just war theory increasingly limit the idea of a just cause simply to defense against aggression. And that focus on wars on defense against aggression as being the only just cause, that's gone along with the increasing secularization of the tradition, although historically the just war theory is a key part of the Christian tradition. Increasingly, secular writers have picked it up in the last century or so. A classic text there is the work by Michael Walzer, an American political philosopher, called Just and Unjust Wars, which came out in 1977. And Walzer there defends the theory that a war is just only if it is a war fought in defense against aggression. Walzer argues for that by appeal to the analogy with the individual case, and this is where we come back to the question of the morality of person-to-person, individual behavior. Walzer refers to what he calls the domestic analogy. It's not about domestic life in the narrow sense, but it's an appeal to the analogy with individual self-defense. And this way of thinking is very, very common, of course, isn't it? The idea here is individual self-defense is the most plausible exception to the moral prohibition on the taking of a human life. In a situation where someone is trying to kill you, and the only way in which you can prevent him from doing so is to kill him, then you would be justified in doing so. It's like the Nashville shooting, school shooting example, of course. And of course, what that brings out is that it's not just a question of self-defense, but also defending other people, if necessary, by killing the person who would otherwise kill them. And the plausibility of the justifiability of individual self-defense is that if the fundamental value is human life, then sometimes you have to kill the killer in order to protect human life. And that looks plausible at the individual level. That's classically in conscientious objection tribunals, for example, people who claim conscientious objection would be asked, well, what would you do if someone was trying to kill your mother? And the implication there is if it's all right to kill to save the life of your mother, then it's okay to kill to save the life of your country. Walzer extends the idea of individual killing to say that it's justified not only to protect life, but also to protect freedom. He says that in the individual case, it may be right to use violence or to inflict harm to protect the rights to life and liberty. And then Walzer says, analogous to the individual's rights to life and liberty are a state's rights to territorial integrity and political sovereignty, and states are morally entitled to protect those rights. So that's the analogy then, the analogy with individual self-defense that's intended to explain why defense against aggression is an exception to the prohibition on taking human life. And it's claimed that it also explains why non-combatant immunity is a fundamental principle of just war, of jus in bello. The idea in the individual case is you're justified in protecting life by acting against the killer because the killer is responsible. The killer is not an innocent human being. So in the individual case, it would be wrong to kill innocent bystanders, like the assassin's wife or children or whatever, but it's permissible to kill the killer because he is the person who is responsible for creating that dilemma. So then Walzer would argue, and other people would argue, that the self-defense analogy explains also the principle of non-combatant immunity. Combatants, it said, are not innocent. It's permissible to kill them because by fighting, by their very fact of being combatants, they have lost their own right not to be killed. But innocent civilians have not forfeited their right not to be killed. They have not done anything which would deprive them of their right to life. So, in both Christian and secular versions of just war theory then, as I say, they've increasingly come to focus on the idea that the only just war is a war of defense against aggression, and typically then that view is argued for by appeal to the analogy with the individual case, the analogy with individual self-defense. That's the case for it. I want to suggest that that analogy actually is flawed. And it's flawed in two ways, I think. And this would be my criticism of just war theory. First of all, the analogy with the case of individual self-defense or individual other defense is weak because the invasion of a country, which is said to be analogous to the threat to the life of an individual, the invasion of a country doesn't have the same all or nothing character as a threat to the life of the individual. In the desperate situation where somebody's threatening my life, Well, if I don't, it may be the case that if I don't defend myself, that's it. That's the end of my life. But the invasion of a country is never, or certainly not necessarily, the end of that country. The invasion of a country is crucially different from the taking of the life of an individual. We might metaphorically describe it as, you know, the killing of a country, but it's not literally that. It might be analogous if the invaders were themselves intent on killing the inhabitants of the country that they're invading. Sometimes there are wars of genocide. Sometimes it might actually be individual lives that are at stake. And in resisting invasion, one would be directly protecting individual lives. But then one would be going beyond the analogy with the individual case. But the analogy itself, I'm suggesting, can't do the work. Invading a country is, in crucially important moral respects, not the same as threatening the life of an individual. And so though it may be morally permissible to kill to defend a person's life, it doesn't follow that it's morally permissible to kill in war to defend a country. The analogy is weak, I think. It doesn't hold up. And also, I think, it's a weak analogy when you think about it, if it's supposed to be making the case for non-combatant immunity. In the individual case, as I say, it gets its plausibility from the idea that the attacker is the person who's responsible, that the attacker is guilty, the attacker is culpable, and therefore it's permissible to take his life if that's the only way to protect life. But in war, enemy combatants, whom it's supposed to be permissible to kill, enemy combatants in the invading forces are only, in a very diminished sense, culpable. They're not, in most cases, responsible for the war, responsible for the invasion. And it's by no means clear that they have forfeited their right to life in the way in which an individual killer might do so. Arguably, killing combatants in war is just as much a case of killing the innocent as is the bombing of cities. Killing German soldiers in the Second World War, most of them, I guess, were conscripts soldiers as innocent as the civilians who were killed by the bombing of cities. So, insofar as modern versions of just war theory depend on the analogy with individual self-defense, I think it's flawed. And although, of course, there's a much more that could be said about just war theory, insofar as modern versions of it typically appeal to that analogy, I think they fail. And the conclusion I'd want to draw, although, as I say, this would require much more argument, the conclusion I'd want to draw is that war can never be just. I think particularly for that last point. The victims of war on either side are typically not culpable. They haven't forfeited their lives, and in killing them, one is doing a terrible wrong. What we should never lose sight of, and I think the basic problem with just war theory it tends to lose sight of, is the human cost of war. The point that I brought in right at the beginning. The soldier that is killed is a human being like you, and that's the loss of that life is an irreparable loss. War always, almost always, modern war involves killing the innocent. And therefore, it can never be just. At most, it may be a tragic necessity. So that's summarizing what I was saying just there. So I don't think that I don't myself think that the just war theory works. I don't think it succeeds in showing that war can be just, but the caveat that I added was maybe at most war can be a tragic necessity. And maybe there is a case for saying that however terrible, however tragic, maybe, in many people's minds, of course, it seems difficult not to allow that a war in defense, in resistance to aggression, may be the one morally acceptable reason for resort to war. If we think of the case that I'm sure is typically in our minds at the moment. I think this was why people thought it'd be particularly appropriate to have a talk on this topic this evening, the war that's come about as a result of the invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces. I think when we think about that case, it epitomizes what people still, not necessarily in the terms of just war theory, but just at a sort of common sense level, think, well, what else could they have done? The cost for Ukrainians of deciding not to resist would have been very high. They would have been sacrificing their ability to shape their own future, to build a shared life for themselves of a kind that they would want. And that's not just a legalistic matter of sovereignty and borders. It's a sacrifice of things that matter to people. But on the other hand, of course, the costs of resisting are also appallingly high. Not only the loss of life that we're seeing, but the immense destruction of infrastructure, of buildings and social infrastructure, and of course, again, crucial to bear in mind, the Russian losses as well, up to 200,000 Russian combatants killed, I think it's been estimated. So, at a terrible cost, but nevertheless, many people would say, I think, when we think about a case like that, surely the Ukraine has a right to resist, if necessary, by military means. If there is a case for that conclusion, then it seems to me the most plausible basis for it is not just war theory and the appeal to individuals, the analogy with individual self-defense. I think the most plausible basis, I would say, for seeing wars of defense against aggression as different would be a pragmatic one. It's a pragmatic case for saying that allowing that wars of defense against aggression may be just is a valuable principle of international life and of international law, because it's our best bet for making wars less likely. That's a notion encapsulated in the United Nations Charter, which, as you see there, says that the one permissible case there where it might be right for a country to go to war is in defense of its right to resist aggression. That's according to the UN Charter, that's the only permissible case for going to war. And, of course, if all countries stuck to that principle, there would be no war, because nobody would start a war. So there's a plausible, pragmatic case, I think, for saying that to uphold the principle that the only permissible war is a war of defense against aggression is the best bet in a difficult world, the best bet for reducing the likelihood of war, the most hopeful route to the prevention of war. And I think, likewise, there's a pragmatic case for the principle of non-combatant immunity. It's our best, and that's enshrined in, again, in international law, in the Geneva Conventions. It's our best bet for limiting the destructiveness of war. So, these are fragile bits of equipment. Anyway, I may not come on again. So what I've been doing then, what I've been doing then, I've been criticizing just war theory, but I've been suggesting that there may be pragmatic reasons for retaining its core conditions. Pragmatic reasons for saying that defense against aggression may be the one legitimate case for going to war because it will make wars less likely, and the principle of non-combatant immunity is maybe arguably defensible because it will make wars less destructive. I need to get a move on here, so I'm going to quickly skip to the next section, which is to look at the question, very controversial one, why limit it to wars of defense against aggression? What about what are sometimes called wars of humanitarian intervention, the classic case there? was the invasion of Iraq in 2003, very controversial, of course. It was not on the part of the Allies, United States and Britain. It was not a war of defense against aggression. It was an invasion of another country. And the case that was made for it there was that it was necessary. Well, there were various cases that were made, but the most plausible one was that it was the only way to overthrow a tyrannical regime and to protect human rights. I want to suggest very briefly, I don't have time to go into this properly, but what that illustrates is, I think, Huxley's point that war is not a good way of upholding human rights. Very much like what Huxley said in the 1930s. To invade a country, whatever your intentions, however humanitarian the intentions, will always involve using force, using violence. It will always typically be resisted. It will therefore initiate a cycle of increasing violence. And I would say that's what we saw happening in Iraq in 2003 onwards. We could discuss that further perhaps in discussion, but that I think is an example, illustrates why wars of humanitarian intervention are not a good idea, but if there is a pragmatic case for war, it's on the basis of the UN Charter that the only justifiable grounds for going to war is defense against aggression. So, to sum up the position that I've been looking at, it's a position that you could label, people sometimes use this term, pacificism rather than pacifism. A bit of a mouthful. But in the literature on the ethics of war, the phrase pacificism is sometimes used to refer to a position which is not absolute pacifism, but does involve a strong presumption against war, the recognition that war is always terrible, that it always involves a tragic loss of life, that therefore the only wars which should be fought are wars of defense against an invasion, but they're not just wars, they are simply, at best, a tragic necessity. And because war is so terrible, because there's always a strong presumption against war, any war should always be fought with a view to establishing how it can be ended and how peace can be restored. And the defense policies of governments should be aimed at making wars less likely by being geared to defense in the strict sense. That's the pragmatic position which I'd describe as pacificism rather than absolute pacifism, but it's grounded in the same values. I wanted to say a little bit about the current situation, but I haven't really got much time for that. But and I have no expertise in talking about Iraq and the current war anyway. But just two quick things. I know people are horrified by the thought of what's going on and what one can do. And of course, it's very difficult to think about what one can do other than just observe a terrible situation from a distance. But two things I'll just throw out for discussion, two things. One is to look with unease at the rhetoric used by some of our politicians, by the previous Prime Minister, for example, who said, we are going to keep going further and faster to push Russia out of the whole of Ukraine. That's a kind of empty rhetoric, it seems to me, the empty courage that comes all too easily. And it's a step forward, at least, to hear the current Prime Minister say, of course, this war will end, as all conflicts do, at the negotiating table. That illustrates, I think, the point that in any war, however justified it may be, there always has to be a view to how it can be ended. You don't just go into a war aiming at total victory. You always have to fight it in such a way that it can be brought to an end. The other thing I want to stress in conclusion is to think about the language we use when talking about this war and any war. And that really comes back to where I started. It's always crucial never to lose sight of, never to talk just in abstractions which hide the real human cost of war. It's not just a war between Russia and the Ukraine, not just Putin's war. It's a war in which people on both sides, including young Russian conscripts, are dying along with Ukrainian military and civilians. If you'll forgive me, I want to end therefore just on a personal note One of my most precious possessions is a letter that my dad wrote when he was fighting in the Second World War. He was in Italy, and this is the letter that he wrote back to my grandma in 1945. And I'm just going to quote this to sum up really the starting point that I suggested for our thinking about these matters. This is what my dad wrote to my grandma in 1945. The worst time we had in the last do was when we caught a packet from our own bombers, that's typical, at the Seino crossing. 2 Poles were killed under our tank, and I was sheltering with them at the time. So once again, my luck held. That was about the closest shave I had. At last made my gums bleed, but otherwise I felt okay. And then Dad went on, not very encouraging for us, though, not very encouraging for us, though, just before we were due to go in, although it gave us a very slight idea of what Jerry was going through. He got that all day. I find that a very touching reminder of my dad's own experience of the human cost of war, the fact that he was nearly killed, and it never happened, I never saw him, but also his thinking, that's what Jerry was going through all day. And it's that human cost of war, I think, that has to underlie all the theory, all the ethical theorizing that we attempt when thinking about the justification of it. My apologies, Rosemary, for going on too long, but I will stop there. What? Sit, I can sit. Oh, okay, right.
Thank you for that very clear exposition. So we now come to questions, and just to emphasize that we really do want questions as succinct as possible so that we can get as many people in as possible. And I think I need to say, am I right in thinking that we are being recorded? Yes. So you might want to be aware
Can't start again.
And it will go on to the website and to YouTube, so just to let you know that. So I'm going to hand the microphone over. And the microphone will come to you. So.
Thank you very much, Professor Norman, for that wonderfully comprehensive talk. I'd just like to make 3 quick points. One on the biblical text side. Do you distinguish between different times in Christian history? It seems that the early phase of the very early Christ and the early Christians seem to have a very different response than Paul and Augustine and all the others who were, in a way, accommodating themselves to the Roman Empire in a different way from Christ. On the acts of omission and commission, is there an ethical and moral difference between deciding that you won't make an act of a commission, you won't do something, even if you know that somebody else could make, you're omitting stopping them, but it's not your moral act if you do. And the third question on the pragmatic case that you put, with Article 51 and so on, how do you deal with the fact that pretty much every country and every leader who's gone to war has claimed that it's in self-defense? I mean, Putin certainly argues that he's upholding the UN Charter, acting against Nazism, stopping the West, overthrowing Russia and so on.
Well, that's a comprehensive set of questions, if I might say so. Yeah, on the biblical, on the text, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I know there's a lot of people who could answer that much better than I do. I mean, a classic claim that's often made, of course, is that Christian thinking on war started to change with the conversion of Constantine. But of course, that doesn't explain why Paul takes the position that he does. Maybe that's got something to do with the fact that, Paul is very deliberately preaching Christianity as a doctrine for the Gentiles, and therefore addressing that wider world of the Roman Empire. But I don't know. But, I think you yourself have suggested that maybe there's something like that as an explanation. Acts and omissions, and the idea was, well, couldn't one, if I've understood you, couldn't one say, I'm only responsible for what I do. I'm not responsible for what other people might do as a result of my failing to stop them. You're right. I mean, there's a complication to the discussion of acts and omissions there that I didn't talk about, which is important, right? I think it would be patently irresponsible to say we're not responsible for the evils that we fail to tackle. We're only responsible for what we do. I mean, it would not be convincing to say we're not responsible for feeding the starving. If they die, they die. All we're responsible for is not killing them, but if they die because there are things that we could do to save their lives and we don't do them, that's not our responsibility. That would seem a grossly limited notion of what our moral responsibilities are. What you bring out with your question, though, is that though we may be responsible for the evils that we fail to prevent, we're not necessarily responsible for the evils that other people bring about and which we do nothing to stop. Now, it's difficult to formulate a clear position there, I think. You could say we're responsible for what we do. We're not responsible for what other people do. But it seems to me that would be too general a principle. I mean, sometimes we are responsible for what other people do. If we fail to in less dramatic cases, if we fail to argue with them, if we fail to try to convince them, we can't just say simply, well, other people's behavior is not our responsibility. So, yeah, it's a complication to it, yes. Yeah, but simply saying we are as responsible for our omissions as for our acts is too simple. Where other people's agency comes into the picture is a difficult question, I guess. Then finally, on what I said about the pragmatic case for wars of defense, you said, well, I argued, well, it's our best bet for a principle of international law and international life that would limit the resort to war. And as you rightly say, countries violate it all the time. And Putin claims it's a war of self-defense. All I would say is, it's pretty clear that it's not. Putin makes that claim. The value of the principle of non-aggression is, it's clear that he's talking nonsense. Compare that with the notion of wars of humanitarian intervention. There, it's very difficult to say what would be a war to uphold human rights and what wouldn't. That's part of the problem with, which I didn't have time to go into, part of the problem with the idea of wars of humanitarian intervention. Who decides? Who decides what human rights are being violated? Who decides whether the war would, whether they're sufficiently important to justify a military intervention or not? Whereas, relatively speaking, at least, in contrast to that, principles of defense and aggression are relatively clear-cut. Of course, statesmen will always try to violate them, but the advantage of that principle is it's pretty patent most of the time, but that's what they're doing. The invasion of Ukraine was not a defensive war on the part of Russia. Okay, thanks so much.
I hope that I'm not oversimplifying your comment, but I think I heard you saying that the outcome of any war must be a negotiation. I'm just wondering what you're seeing might be scope for the basis of such a negotiated outcome in the case of the invasion of Ukraine?
I guess I want to skip that and say it's not for us to say, really. You know, I was making that remark in the context of the rhetoric used by some of our leaders, right? I think Macron, French president, has been more impressive than any of our politicians, I think, insofar as he's not only said, you know, it can only end with agreement and a negotiated settlement. He's also said, rightly, I think, if that's to be achievable, then it's important that the war is not fought in such a way as to humiliate Russia. It might be tempting to say we need to humiliate Russia, and that's what some of our leaders have said. You know, but you know, the Russian leadership needs to be given a way out. People always, as in any conflict, need to be able to back down without losing face too much. So no, I mean, I don't have a direct answer to your question as to what the basis of it might be. All I can say is the kinds of ways in which politicians in this country ought to talk in such a way as to try to make that more feasible rather than make it more difficult. I'm sorry, I'm ducking your question. I don't know. Do you want to come back on it? No. No.
Thank you very much, Richard. That's very interesting indeed to go through these arguments that we were particularly active in reviewing in the 1980s in this town, weren't we? I have to say that for most of us in this room, the question is slightly abstract. And certainly, I think Christians would want to say, you know, it's what we do that really matters.
Right.
What we do. Now, for our parents' generation, I mean, my father was an officer in the Second World War preparing landing grounds in Africa. And I asked him, have you ever killed anyone? And he said, no, I never wanted, couldn't possibly do that. Yeah. But he commanded a unit, you know, preparing landing grounds for aeroplanes. Yeah. Now, I've never been asked to perform military service, you know, nor have I been asked to serve my country, you know, in the war of self-defense. Now, in the 1980s, and you were part of this, and I know many people in this room were part of it too, when we formed a marvelous group called the Contemporary Christian Peace Group. Yeah. And we did a whole lot of things. I've been going through the papers that we generated just this last year. Just amazing. But I want to ask you, and this is the question, what do you make of the so-called theology of nuclear deterrence? Oh, right. That was the reality. You never mentioned that. You never mentioned that. Now, there was a man called Keith Ward, who's now an extremely eminent professor. We should get him to speak here in Oxford, who invented... Keith Ward? Keith Ward. Yeah. Professor Keith Ward. And Keith invented the so-called theology of deterrence, which aggravated many of us here. Yeah, he wasn't the only one either. Alan Race and I wrote... the Bishop of Oxford, he came to talk in the cathedral, Richard Harris, that's right, yeah. Well, yeah, okay. Anyhow, this was the question in the 1980s. We were not actually discussing the just war. There were two things. I must say, I did. You're going to be asked to come to your question if you're not careful. The question is, what do you make of the theology of deterrence? Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I had a slide on that, which I was going on too long, so I skipped. But I mean, I think, well, there are two aspects to it. I think prior to the notion of deterrence, there is, I think, you know, the fundamental principle that the use of nuclear weapons could never be justified because it would always violate the principle of non-combatant immunity on a massive scale by its very nature. However you understand the notion of innocence, millions of people, of innocent human beings would be killed in the use of any use of nuclear weapons. Now, of course, then you know the argument that then is put is but the whole point of having them is not to use them. Always a bizarre position, it seems to me. But you know, nevertheless, you know, there could be a plausibility in that. I guess then, I mean, my response to that would be an empirical one, actually. You know, we've come very close to using them through
political brinkmanship, through the danger of accidental nuclear war. You know, we've been lucky that we've survived. We've been lucky that there hasn't been a nuclear war. So, although in theory, I would say, you might disagree here, you want to say not even in theory, but I would say in theory the idea of deterrence, of having nuclear weapons in order to ensure that they are never used, in theory might be arguable, but in practice not, because it always carries with it the real possibility that they might be used. And of course the current situation that we're in is one where that possibility is very much in people's minds, because if the stalemate that exists in the Ukraine persists, then it will become increasingly tempting for Russian forces and the Russian government to use nuclear weapons as the only way of breaking the stalemate. So, yeah, that would be my answer to your question. I'd love to get to know what your answer is, but I think I know. But it's not on yet.
Thank you, Richard. Good. I read the slide you put up from Huxley with interest. Wars of whatever nature create resentment, hatred, and revenge in those upon whom the war is waged. Is the corollary of that the pacifist against whom the war is waged be always without bitterness, resentment, hatred, or thoughts of revenge against those who wage the war against them?
Well, I can't speak for Huxley. I mean, it's a huge generalization, and that's the problem with it. But insofar as it's a plausible generalization, again, he's talking at the level of whole populations, isn't he? So I don't think he's claiming, every war will always create desire for revenge on the part of the whole of the population against whom it's waged. Right? But at the level, at the large-scale level of whole populations and whole societies, it will, by its very nature, tend to generate that kind of a response. That seems plausible?
It's the reverse of that interests me.
Right.
That what should the pacifist's response to war therefore always be? Never to seek revenge, never to feel bitterness.
Yes. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Well, I would say yes. I would say yes. It should be right. But the problem then is, that's not a sufficient case for pacifism, right? I mean, and the individual pacifist. Yes, I can see where you're going here. It comes back to the earlier issues, doesn't it? The individual pacifist. We're talking about an individual Christian in a country that's being invaded and aggressed against, right? And it might be right to say then that the proper response on the part of the pacifist as an individual is to say, I'm not going to seek revenge. I'm not going to generate feelings of bitterness and so forth. The problem then is, can the individual Christian say that on behalf of the rest of the population? Right? And that's where we come back to the issue of acts and omissions. Doesn't the individual pacifist nevertheless still have a responsibility to decide what to do about his or her fellow citizens who are being killed? So, and it might be that there you have to drive a wedge between the individual response and the wider context.
Not every Christian is a pacifist. What is the main reason for somebody to be a pacifist? I mean, if I read about Hiroshima and I listen to the witness of the Habakshka, who were the survivors, then I am deeply moved, and I'm saying to myself, war is evil. But a lot of people don't even address themselves to the effects of war. They've forgotten them. So isn't education needed? You know, you can't just be abstract about it,
absolutely.
can you?
Yeah.
You know, you've got the Chernobyl prayer by Svetlana Alexievich. I can't pronounce the name properly. People don't read these things. They don't really care because they're sort of kind of absorbed in the problems of daily life. Is there any way that they can be moved to be more committed, more passionate about it?
Well, I wish I knew. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, as a philosopher, my besetting sin is always being too abstract. And it was a rather abstract talk that I gave. But also, I tried to say at several points, it's important not to think in abstractions. That's why I said several times, it's always vital if we're thinking about the ethics of war to bring it back to the real human cost of war in terms of actual individual human lives. That's absolutely, and that's absolutely the starting point and the end point, I think, for all of our discussions on this. Now, that you then followed up with the question, but how do we get that across? I guess education in schools is key here, isn't it? Like David here, thinking back to the sorts of things that some of us have done. I used to go into schools when it was okay for schools to invite somebody in from CND to talk about the effects of nuclear weapons. I went in several times and talked about it. I don't know what opportunities there are these days. Of course, there are other urgent topics, but maybe in the current situation will prompt schools and teachers to think how important it is to have education that addresses the issue of what the real nature of war and what it really means, which is why I ended with a letter from my dad. But what the answer to the practical question is as to how one gets opportunities to do it, I don't know. Do you have an answer? Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
They're piled up.
Yeah.
They're sort of excessive.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's important to make the connections between these different issues, isn't it? Of course. I mean, at present, at last, the issues of the environment and climate change and so forth are getting a real purchase amongst the young and in schools and so forth, and that's great. But then it's important not to lose sight of the other issues, and in particular the issues of peace and war. And so it's important to make those connections as well, as I think you were just doing. That's right. Yeah.
We've been talking about a Christian response or a response when war actually happens. I've just been thinking about another theme in Scripture, the theme of peacemaking. And Paul says in Ephesians that Jesus died making peace, so it's fairly fundamental. And blessed are the peacemakers, and there's a verse in Acts as well. This is laying the ground. Well, it seems to me that we're called to lay the ground for war actually not to happen, or social upheavals not to happen. What do you feel about the relative use of peacemaking in Christian teaching?
I don't know what I'd say. I have to say it. I don't know what I'd say about it from a specifically Christian point of view. But I guess the important theme, and if you're thinking about peacemaking, is to invoke that phrase so often rightly invoked about the inseparability of peace and justice. And this is where, again, what I was saying just now about making the connections between the different issues would be important. The issue of climate change, for example, if it's not addressed much more radically than it's been addressed so far, will create increasing inequality. I mean, the global inequalities are huge at the moment, and climate change is on course to make them even greater. And the immediate victims of climate change and global warming are the people who did least to cause it, the people in the global south whose crops are already failing, who are likely to be the ones to be the first at the receiving end of rising sea levels. And that's going to give rise to increasing conflict. It's going to give rise to increasing movement of populations, which will itself bring further causes for conflict. So all these things are connected. I'm sometimes a bit hesitant about sort of, lumping everything in together to a sort of ethical global mishmash, but they are genuinely connected. And in terms of peacemaking, in the sense of trying to create a world in which there is less likelihood of a resort to war, I think we need to look at those sorts of connections. We need to look at issues of global justice, as so many Christian organizations rightly do. I mean, the way in which Christian Aid, for example, frames these connections is very impressive. So I guess that's where I would start, yes, looking at the connection between peace and justice.
Richard, when I was thinking about a vote of thanks, I thought back over my life and realized that having been born a couple of years after the Second World War, and of course learning history as one learned history in those days, which was punctuated by names like Hastings, Agincourt, Bosworth, Waterloo, Trafalgar. It was all the glories of war, because we were the winners, and that's the way I grew up, particularly as a member of the half of the human race that have caused most of the wars. So I found myself coming tonight thinking, I've never actually thought about pacifism. It's just been there. We've sat on an island for the last how many years, and we've been inoculated against war until the last few years, when Iraq and now Ukraine has actually brought us face to face, if you like, with the sort of questions that you were wrestling with us on our behalf tonight. I'm deeply grateful for the way in which you expressed all the ideas, very clear, setting things out, arguing in one case, and then in the nicest possible way demolishing that particular argument and moving on to something else. Very helpful indeed. But what I finish up with is a lot more knowledge, but the comment I am most grateful for is the one you made at the beginning of the evening, that as you get older, it gets less clear. And that's the way I find myself. Lots of arguments, lots of ideas, which is just what we wanted. And I come back to one of my favourite quotations, which Robert Bolt put into the mouth of Thomas More in A Man for All Seasons, that God made angels to show him splendour, as he made animals for innocence and plants for their simplicity, but man he made to serve him wittily in the tangle of his mind. So Richard, thank you for encouraging us to serve God or serve whatever we want in the tangle of our minds. It's been an inspiring evening. Thank you.
quote. Thank you. Just bear with me with a bit of business. I hope this is still being shown. Is it, Glenn? Thank you. So this is a notice to everyone, those that are here and those that are online. Just to remind you that our next meeting is on the 17th of May, and we've got another weighty subject with Anthony Reddy, who is a black liberation theologian coming from Oxford, and he's going to talk to us about Black Lives Matter, a theologically absurd necessity. So I'll leave you to ponder that, and we hope that we'll have a good turnout for that. And then our session ends in June with retired Bishop Paul Bayes, who was Bishop of Liverpool Cathedral, who is going to talk about the poor are always with us. And I think we will just have had Christian Aid Week, well, a few weeks before that. And as Richard and our last speaker said, all the issues of the world conflict and build into unrest, poverty being one of them. So I'm really looking forward to that talk as well, and I hope that that will be well attended. If I can just get a little bit of a nag in, we do need, I hope those at home will realise that the quality of this evening, though it has been, Richard lit the touch paper, but the quality of the questions and debate are second to none in Canterbury, and that's what we value here. And so we really would like to encourage some of you that are watching at home to come in to the last two of our meetings and to take part in the debate. And also we'd like to appeal to your pockets online. If you haven't paid this year, there are different ways of paying. We have changed our bank, but the new details will be going on the website soon. But we are not averse to receiving cheques or cash. So please pay your £5 for every talk you've listened in on. So I'm sorry it comes to the chair to be sort of dampen all the spirits for the evening, but these things do need to be said. Thank you again to Richard for coming. I can't hear you. What time? They all start at 7:30. Yes, yes. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Safe journey home.